Welcome, Westside family, and anyone else joining us in our study of early church history. Today, we're going to look at those of Caesar's household. I think you will find it very fascinating. The passage that comes out of Philippians 4, verse 22, of those that were at the highest echelon tied to the Roman emperor himself who became Christians. And the Apostle Paul mentions that in the book of Philippians. And so we're going to look at, found a man who had written a whole chapter on this in the early church literature. And I hope you'll find it as fascinating as I did. And then we're also going to look at early church assemblies, what those of the second century, the century that followed right after the apostles, what they say about their meeting times, assemblies, and those kinds of things. And then at a few places that have been discovered where the early Christians met. So I hope you'll find that interesting today. We're also going to sum up Rome's persecution. We concluded that in a couple of studies that we have done already. So Tertullian, remember, is a Roman writer. He is a very learned man, a lawyer, very influential in the city of Carthage, becomes a Christian. And about 200 AD, roughly around in there, he is very confident of Christianity's growing influence. He says, in writing to a Roman proconsul, he says, "We have filled everything you have, cities, tenements, forts, towns, exchanges, yes, and army camps, tribes, palace, senate, forum. All we have left you is the temples." So from the very lowest of society, the slaves, even the imperial slaves, all the way to, we would say, the palace, where the imperial slaves would be, the Senate, those that would be the rulers of Rome, and even the Forum, of course, where they would have operated. There are Christians everywhere, even in the army, and you find lots of references about this. So he is pleading with a Roman a proconsul about not destroying Christians. By the time of the great persecution, Diocletian's, between 303 and 312, Paul McKechnie says the numbers of Christians had increased to a point where wiping Christianity out empire-wide was not a realistic political project. And of course, this would be because Christians at that highest level were the ones who ran the Roman Empire. So if you destroyed all of those, it worked for the emperor himself. And the household of Caesar doesn't just mean the family, the physical family. It includes that, obviously, but it means those that were of his household, all his slaves. So those were considered the house of Caesar also, and they are the ones who had become Christians by and large, and were the ones running the Roman Empire. To destroy them, to kill them, of course, would have been to cut off his own right hand. The emperor would not have been helping himself to do that. And so that's Tertullian's argument. In writing to the proconsul of Africa, which is where Carthage is, the North Africa, that African province is called that, and he describes the proconsul of Asia, which we know as Turkey, Asia Minor in the Roman days, who had declined such violence. Now, he didn't do it willingly, but just because of the sheer numbers. When Arius Antoninus was persecuting in Asia, all the Christians of the city in one united band, Tertullian says, presented themselves before his judgment seat, on which, ordering a few to be led forth to execution, he said to the rest, "You wretches, if you want to die, you have cliffs and ropes." So he wasn't going to kill everybody. I mean, he realized how defeatist that would be in trying to kill that many people. And so he only killed a few and hoped the rest of them would kill themselves. And so Tertullian then uses that argument on the proconsul of Africa. And he says, if we should take it into our heads in Carthage to do the same thing here, what will you make of so many thousands of so many men and women, persons of every sex and age and every rank, when they present themselves before you? How many fires, how many swords will be required? Of course, we'll know later Decius, about the middle of that 3rd century, in 250 after Tertullian, 250, 260, would try to do that, and then another 40 or so or 50 years, Diocletian would try to do the same, to empire-wide wipe out Christianity. But they would find out that just politically, practically was not feasible. And so Tertullian is making that argument. Okay, let's turn our attention now to that phrase in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 22, where the Apostle Paul says at that place, let me get there. I was in the first chapter of Philippians. For Philippians 4, verse 22, all the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Now remember, the Apostle Paul at this time is in Roman imprisonment. He is in Rome when he writes the book of Philippians. In fact, he tells us in chapter 1, beginning about verse 12, "But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which have happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." You might think being in prison would be a detriment. "So that it has become evident to the whole palace guard," and he means the Praetorian Guard, the Roman soldiers that were the bodyguard to the Roman emperor, "and to all the rest, that my chains are in Christ." So at this very time, the Apostle Paul is enchained, and even the palace guard is guarding him. And so he's writing about the fact of those he knows in Caesar's household who are Christians. Now remember, this does not mean just the kinsmen of Caesar. It would include that. But his house would be all his slaves, and he would have thousands of slaves who were imperial slaves, and therefore be called the household of Caesar, or in the Latin term, Familia Caesarius. So let's take this quote from Paul McKechnie. "These servants were not only the people who staffed the palace on the Palatine Hill in Rome, but the whole Familia Caesarius, the household of Caesar, as Paul talked about, the organization of slaves and freedmen." Freedmen were those who had been former slaves and had gained their freedom, "who staffed all the places, residential, bureaucratic, commercial, industrial, owned personally by the emperor throughout Rome, the city of Rome, and his estates that were across the whole empire." So the family Caesarius extended throughout the entire Roman Empire. The emperor's staff at the bottom there numbered in the thousands. All the lower and middle levels of the civil service were considered his household, even under the very highest ranks. So when the Apostle Paul cites that, we don't necessarily understand that to mean those that were kin to Caesar, that would have had the highest rank in society, but would be his slaves. Now, another passage that's interesting, turn over to the book of Romans with me. And remember, here at the end, Paul talks about several people that he greets. Remember, he didn't form the church at Rome. The church at Rome was not a church Paul planted. It probably came out of the day of Pentecost. There were those on that day that were there from the city of Rome, took the gospel back and preached it and formed churches in the city of Rome. But in verses 10 and 11, there are some names that are mentioned. Look at them with me. Romans 16 and verse 10. "Greet Apelles, approved in Christ. Greet those who are of the household of Aristobulus." We're going to come back to him in a minute. "Greet Herodion, my kinsman." You can see he's obviously taking Herod's name, but Paul says he's my kinsman. "Greet those who are of the household of Narcissus, who are in the Lord." And so he talks about two great households, one of Aristobulus and one of Narcissus. I've highlighted that for you. There are two commentators, von Harnack, these are old commentators, and J.B. Lightfoot, you may be familiar with him, identified Narcissus with the Emperor Claudius. So he'd be of those first Roman emperors about in the 50s, the 40s and 50s, Emperor Claudius. Narcissus was the Emperor Claudius's freedman. So he had been a slave, and then he had become free under Claudius. But he still, even if you were a freedman, now the one who freed you, your former master, was your patron, and you still owed him duty. When somebody was freed, they didn't get to just go away. They still owed him duty that they had to pay. They had to work for him. But they were also permitted to own slaves themselves. You can imagine that. Even a slave was permitted sometimes to own slaves under the Roman Empire, but particularly freedmen. The other man that was mentioned in that passage is Aristobulus, and he could most likely be the uncle of Herod the Great, so the very Herodian family. And it's interesting that Paul mentions the name of one Herodion right in that connection. So obviously Herod's name. And then McKechnie goes on to say about Narcissus. Narcissus had, that he says Lightfoot and Harnack were pointing out, Narcissus had his own great house and slaves and freedmen, but his assets, including his slaves, would have been absorbed into the imperial ownership when he died in 54, 55 AD. So they would have gone back into the Roman ownership, even though he was a freedman. Remember what I said, his patron, he owed him. And so he was given a great latitude more after he became a freedman. But these two men may possibly be in the book of Romans, those that again were part of the imperial household and would be considered Caesar's household. All right, so McKechnie goes on to say there was a whole category of Christians who held an important place in Roman society who, throughout the first 3 centuries, could almost count on a degree of safety from persecution. These were the emperor's own servants. It would just be ludicrous to him to destroy his right hand, to cut it off, as effect, because these people actually served him many times to the very highest echelons. They will find statements about them being his chamberlain. For instance, they would have laid out his clothes. This guy would have been the fellow who decided who would see him, like the chief of staff of the president of the United States has complete control of who sees the president that day, and you have to get through him first if you're going to get to the president. So some of these men that became Christians were at that very highest echelon of serving the emperor. He goes on to say, it was a strange anomaly which made the emperor's personal service possibly the safest place for a Christian to be. The emperor's servants were the people who really ran the empire. The long-term effects of Christian influence were considerable. And so would come to be, as Tertullian said, we have staffed everything. And is it going to make any sense for you to kill all of the Christians, especially when many of them run the empire? All right, the next time we come to is from when Paul writes the book of Philippians in the 40s, 50s AD. Probably he wrote Philippians in the early 60s, but when he had preached there. The next time we come to Caesar's household is under Domitian. And there are 2 individuals here who actually are related. Now is Caesar's relations, physical relations. One of them is a lady by the name of Flavia Domitilla. And she is of senatorial rank, and she is exiled. Eusebius is the one that tells us about this 2 or 3 centuries later when he writes. He describes Domitilla's exile as, quote, a witness to Christ, speaking of her Christianity. And her husband, most likely her husband, there's some question about this, Flavius Clemens, who was a consul himself in 95, very high rank, would have been the highest rank among the emperor's people that helped serve the empire, also fell under Domitian, according to Suetonius. Suetonius was a Roman writer. And so here is a family tree, the Flavian family tree. And the Flavian had 3 Roman emperors that made up that dynasty, Vespasian. And also remember, this is at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Vespasian was the one conducting that war and that would proceed to Jerusalem. And Nero is killed finally, or takes his own life. He's about to be killed by the Roman senators that had finally decided they've had enough of his craziness and put him under death sentence. He takes his own life, and so Vespasian has to rush back to Rome to be able to make sure he secures his emperorship. And he puts his son Titus, notice the purple squares. If you'll follow the lines that connect it, Vespasian was married to a lady by the name of Domitilla the Elder. And so that name's going to be passed down in the family tree. And so Titus and Domitian are the sons of Vespasian. And so Vespasian and Domitilla the Elder also have a daughter named Domitilla the Younger. See that square right below Vespasian to the left of Titus. Then she has a daughter, and I've circled that, who is Flavia Domitilla. And that's the one that is mentioned by Eusebius as being exiled because she was a witness for Christ. And married to, notice the line connecting her, to Titus Flavius Clemens, who is the one we mentioned. And so this is his niece. Notice that Domitian and Domitilla the Younger, the line would be that they were brother and sister. And so this is his niece that he exiles instead of killing her. There's some, I think Suetonius mentioned that Clemens was executed, her husband, but most of the time women were exiled, sometimes killed. And so into the very family tree of the Roman emperors, Caesar's household, as we would think a kinsman, these 2 are mentioned as being part of that and that they were Christians. All right, we go forward about 60 years. The next time we run into mention of Caesar's household is under Marcus Aurelius. It's actually Marcus Antonius, Antonius, or Antoninus, I should say. Justin Martyr is the actual Christian, and again, he takes the word martyr because he was executed, beheaded under Marcus Aurelius. He wrote his first apology, and again, defense of Christianity, under the Emperor Antoninus, and that's the one who preceded Mark Aurelius. He came to Rome, established a Christian school there to teach Christianity, and during Marcus Aurelius's reign, Justin was sentenced to death along with 6 companions. One of these companions is a man by the name of Euelpistus, if I'm pronouncing that right, who was a follower of Justin, and when he was questioned, he answered that he was an imperial slave. So he was part of the Familia Caesareus, the family of Caesar, because he would have been one of the connected to that household. And because he was found, Paul McKechnie says, at a class in Justin's lodgings, Euelpistus, or Euelpistus, I'm having trouble pronouncing that, was put to death for being a Christian. And he goes on to comment, McKechnie does, but he may have been unlucky to have been punished. Membership in the imperial household ordinarily conferred some protection against government action. The basic Roman expectation was that punishing slaves should be left up to the business of their master. And if your master was the emperor, well, then the courts had reason to hesitate to impose punishment which might encroach on his prerogative. So for whatever reason, this Roman slave Euelpistus is put to death rather than being protected by being an imperial slave. And right after him then, Commodus, who is the son of Marcus Aurelius, we read of 3 writings through 3 different men. Hippolytus says that Callistus, who later became Bishop of Rome, was the slave of Carpophorus, a Christian, quote, of the emperor's household, Hippolytus tells us, during the reign of Commodus. Irenaeus, who was Bishop of Lyon in France, in Gaul at that time, the Roman province of Gaul, refers, quote, to those who are in the royal palace who are believers. So Tertullian had said, and in fact, that's the reference I make to him at the bottom in the 190s, lists the palace, that Christians had gone as far as the palace and the Senate and the Forum. And so here are 3 guys that are at the end of that time period in the 2nd century that say Christians had made a great inroads into the Roman leadership, or the Roman household of the emperor. McKechnie said it is clear that from the time of Commodus, Christians formed a persistent minority among the emperor's slaves and freedmen. Following Commodus, that ends that line, Aurelius and Commodus, father and son. Now the Severian dynasty will come to pass. Septimius Severus comes to power and rules from 193 to 211. Tertullian, in a pamphlet aimed at, again, remember we referenced this earlier, to induce the governor of Africa to not persecute Christians, claimed, again, as one of his defenses, that Severus knew of Christians in his own household and that he had not persecuted them, even though Severus did persecute Christians in Carthage in the Roman province of Africa in 202 and 203. But he says of him, even Severus himself was mindful of the Christians, for he sought out Proculus the Christian, also called Torpacian, the procurator of Euodia, who had once cured him by means of oil and kept him in his palace to the day of his death. And he goes on to point out that the son, the next ruler in the Severus line, Caracalla, you may also hear it pronounced Caracalla, but Caracalla, the Tertullian states at a pamphlet that Caracalla, who became better known to the Emperor Antoninus, son of Severus, knew Torpacian personally, the one that he had sought out, Severus had sought out, who had healed him with oil, we are told. And he himself, Caracalla, had been brought up, quote, on Christian milk, i.e. meaning that he was nursed by a wet nurse that had been a Christian and an imperial slave. And so McKechnie says the emperors knew what was happening. He says he knows Severus received anointing oil for healing and chose not to punish their slaves and freedmen for Christianity, and that Caracalla knew this, and that he was reluctant to do the same. And so that's what he pled with the North African governor, to not persecute Christians, even though Severus had, but he was trying to plead for consistency. There are the other piece of evidence that we find are Christian gravestones, which before 200 AD, we're going to find out would have been a very, very dangerous thing to say you were a Christian. And of course, from 250 and forward, it would have been dangerous. But in that time period from 200 to the middle of 250, in the 3rd century, we find evidence of it. One of the best evidence of it is here pictured on your left. There is a cast of an epitaph recorded by one Ebersissius, and this is in the Vatican Museum. About 200 AD, the bishop of Hierapolis, in Phrygia, Avaricius, or it's sometimes spelled Abersius, Marcellus, had himself commemorated on his gravestone with a long Greek poem shot through with references to his Christianity. You can look this up if you want to see the details. If you'll notice, there are some dark parts there in the middle of that cast. It's called a cast because a lot of the gravestone was destroyed. But I'm pointing out the dark spots you'll notice in the middle of that epitaph, in the very center of that, were the original. And the other part was because there was a printing, not a printing, but a copy that was made in, I don't remember if it's on leather or in papyrus, but anyway, nonetheless, it was found, and it completed all of this. We know what the complete thing said, even though only pieces of the actual monument have been found. So I show you a map there where Hierapolis is. It was right by Laodicea and Colossae that we know as Bible name places in the 7 churches of Asia, Laodicea, and of course Colossian letter that Paul wrote, and a picture on the right of the ruins of Hierapolis today in Turkey. So this bishop made this gravestone above ground, not in the catacombs, and hiding it out, and it was stated, shot through with references to him being a Christian. The bottom part of this, in the early 3rd century, Christians in the imperial household began taking advantage of their untouchability by putting up gravestones which noted, sometimes cryptically, that the deceased had been a Christian. Christians that died before 200, it was not possible to carve anything on the stone that would have identified them, the deceased, as being a Christian, because that could have meant that their gravestone might have been destroyed, or that people couldn't have gone to visit it openly, especially during periods of persecution. But kind of in that window of the 200 to 250 AD, they were left alone, and they took advantage of that time. From a few years later, 7 Christian inscriptions of the Familia Caesarea survive, all in Latin. 6 of them are in the city of Rome and 1 from its port city, Ostia. Most were on display in above-ground cemeteries that were not, and this is the other significant thing, for Christian use. There are a lot of cemeteries that were only for Christian use, and they buried many people, poor people, even people that might not have been Christians. They took upon themselves to take care of them. And so you will find that in and around the city of Rome, and particularly in the catacombs. They predate the crypt of the popes in the catacomb of Callistus. Remember that he was one of the early bishops of Rome. Later it would be considered a pope, but at this time it'd be more correct to call him a bishop. And even there, discretion in the wording of the grave markers was in order in the 3rd century. The burial place of Bishop Fabian, 236 to 50, who died in the Decian persecution. Of course, consider that where Decian tried to wipe out Christianity, is marked. And it's marked in all caps in the Greek letters. And if you know Greek, you can see Fabianus, all right, Fabianus, and then Epi, our words EPI, and then M, our letter M. And although it is easy today to supplement the abbreviations, Fabianus Epi is really Episcopus, all right? So Episcopus is the word, remember, for overseer, okay? So it's translated bishop in the Old King James, but more than modern versions, if you're using the New American Standard, the English Standard, translates it overseer. So elders, the ones who are selected as a body of men to oversee a local church. And then the M obviously stands for martyr, which we borrowed directly from the Greek. So it was a coded way of saying Fabian, bishop, martyr, his remains are buried here. They may not have been understood easily by non-Christians. Remember that the book of Revelation is written in that apocalyptic type language so that it would be hidden from someone who was not a Christian, but be understood by those who were Christians. And if they came into the crypt, they wouldn't destroy it. This is an actual picture of where the remains of the Bishop Fabian was and where this inscription, part of it, was found. It was later put over, it was taken up from the floor, I believe it was, and put up on the crypt itself. All of the popes were later interred into what they believed was a nicer and a far better place to bury he would have been considered a pope later, but that would have been wrong to think about it right now as that way, because all these other bishops are not granting to the Bishop of Rome the title pope as being the first among bishops in this early first 3 centuries. Here is an entrance to the area of the catacomb of Callistus. You'll sometimes see it spelled with the X. The grave niches as you enter the catacomb of Callistus, and then you enter the crypt of the popes, and there you see how one of them looks like what we saw a minute ago, where the first popes were buried, a place that you can visit today if you were to want to do so in the city of Rome. All right, let's turn our attention now, as we'll close out our lesson, in thinking about early Christian assemblies. The Didache, and we're going to come back to this as we look at some things later in the next 2 lessons, is what is described as one of the earliest manuals directing the church's worship in ethics and governance, and it's dated approximately 100 AD. I mean, some give it an earlier date than that, some a little bit later date in the 2nd century. It's one of the 10 or so writings that are considered the apostolic fathers. So these are not apostles. They might have been associated. They, for instance, we know of some of the early men in the 2nd century that knew disciples who actually had touched the Apostle John, for instance, because he lived so long into the 90s before he died. But these are the ones, these writings come right after the apostles, okay, or the apostolic times in the 1st century. And this particular piece of writing was long hidden from us. It was discovered by the Metropolitan of Nicomedia, which this is when the Greek Orthodox Church broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. So the Church of the East, Greek Orthodox, Church of the West that we know as the Roman Catholic, rediscovered it in 1873. So for a long time, this particular writing was hidden. And here's a quote out of the Didache. It says, "Having earlier confessed your sins so that your sacrifice may be pure, come together each Lord's day of the Lord, break bread," take the Lord's Supper, "and give thanks." But isn't it interesting that he uses that expression, each Lord's day? Now, he calls it the Lord's Day of the Lord, kind of like taking the Old Testament, the Sabbath of the Lord, that they would have come to understand the first day of the week was just called the Lord's Day. So it's like saying the Sabbath of the Lord, the Lord's Day of the Lord, is what some think is why that kind of peculiar phrase. But if you turn over to Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, John says, "I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day." So if Revelation is written in the 90s, remember that that would not be far removed from the Didache in its dating, and referring to Sunday, the first day of the week, as being the Lord's Day. John goes on to say, "I heard behind me a loud voice and a trumpet" in that verse. And so the first day of the week is used because of it being the day upon which the Lord arose from the tomb. In Luke chapter 24, now on the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women came to the tomb, bringing spices to anoint the body, and they found the stone rolled away. And you could go ahead and read the book of Luke, or chapter 24, the book of John, chapter 20, and you would find that first day of the week, the Lord's Day. He arose on that day. And so it became very significant to the early Christians. In fact, their day of worship, prescribed in the New Testament, became the first day of the week. And it makes sense. It was the day of victory. It's the day that the Lord came out of the tomb and was victorious over death And therefore, everything he did on the cross is now imbued with the power that his blood did and does forgive our sins. Because he arose, as the Apostle Paul says, unto our justification, for our justification, in Romans chapter 5. And so in Acts 20 and verse 7, now on the first day of the week when the disciples came together to break bread, notice that same phrase is used in the Didache, and it means obviously taking the Lord's Supper, the only thing God's ever commanded Christians to eat. The only thing we're commanded to eat as Christians, that we do in common together as Christians, the only thing we're commanded to eat is the Lord's Supper. And so breaking bread is taking the first part of that and putting it for the whole. And in Acts 20 and verse 7, it says that on the first day of the week when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them. So he preached. Another thing that would happen on the first day of the week happened there. And then the Apostle Paul, remember, as he's giving order to the church concerning the collection that he's about to take to the saints in Jerusalem, Judea, he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I've given order to the churches of Galatia, so those churches that he established in that Roman province, so you do. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something. So why that particular day? Again, the connection to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then finally, as you know, the book of Hebrews, chapter 10, and verse 25, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And so there was this assembly that occurred as Christians came together, and it was then something that continued. I mean, what I want you to see in some of the things that we're going to look at in the next couple or 3 weeks are that they're not totally leaving the faith. They don't abandon everything in the second century. You have to see that things are beginning to creep in that are not right, but they obviously are still practicing truth. And one of the things that they practice that we can read in the first century in the Word of God itself is that the Christians came together on the first day of the week. And you continue to see that very early in the second century. Ignatius, remember I've mentioned him before, as the bishop of Antioch. He preached the gospel of the Emperor Trajan and was sentenced to be bound in chains and taken to Rome to be fed to wild beasts about 107 AD. Here's a picture of a painting. I can't remember if it was a fresco or if it was on the floor of a great house. It says there in the caption, a painting. About 1000 AD, and it shows lions devouring Ignatius and people watching in the Colosseums there in the background. So Ignatius, as he went on the way, wrote to different Christians. And Everett Ferguson mentions in Early Christian Speak that Ignatius said, if therefore those who lived according to the old practices came to the new hope, so he's talking about Jews who lived according to the old law, they no longer observe the Sabbath, that is the seventh day of the week. That was the day of rest. That was the Sabbath. They no longer observe that, but living according to the Lord's day. And he calls it the same thing John does in the book of Revelation, in which also our life arose through him and his death. So again, Ignatius, about AD 107, before that writing, dies in that year. It refers to those that left the Jewish faith to now worship on Sunday as all other Christians there, those that are Gentiles. And then we skip down to Justin Martyr that we mentioned, who was martyred under Marcus Aurelius, presented his defense to the emperor right before him, Emperor Antoninus. And Justin Martyr says, and on the day called Sunday, remember, that was the Roman way, the Sunday and Moon Day, Monday, that we got the days of our weeks from them, either honoring some god or that type of thing. But the first day of the week, he says, on the day called Sunday, there is a gathering together in the same place of all who live in the city or a rural district. We all make our assembly in common on the day of the sun, since it is the first day. And Jesus Christ, our Savior, arose from the dead on the same day. So that's exactly what we read in the New Testament. And they're continuing to practice of that. Justin Martyr comes about the middle of the second century, 150 AD, when he's writing this apology to the emperor and explaining what they do on the day that the Romans called Sunday, and we have just continued to adopt that into our modern times as the name for that day. He says it is the first day of the week, and that is the day that they assemble as Christians. Again, as Hebrews 10 and verse 25 talked about, and as we saw in Acts 20 and 7, they came together to break bread. And then Tertullian, again around 200 AD, says, others suppose that the sun is the God of the Christians because it's well known that we regard Sunday as a day of joy. But he's going to go on to point out we don't celebrate it for the sun. We celebrate it for a far different reason. If we devote the day of the sun to rejoicing, is for a far different reason than worship of the sun. And he even goes on to talk about, again, why did the Sabbath go by the wayside? To us, Sabbaths are foreign. You have a whole group of people today, the Adventists, Seventh-day Adventists, that believe you have to worship on the seventh day. And they worship on Saturday, and they continue to hold that, even though they claim to be Christians. They claim to follow Jesus Christ. But you can see that even the early Christians in the 2nd century abandoned the Sabbath. They're foreign to us. We don't worship on the Sabbath. Again, it's what you read in the 1st century. They didn't worship on the Sabbath. The great day was the day of the Lord's resurrection. And the whole change. Imagine Jews who would have just never abandoned the Sabbath, abandoned the Sabbath. They're the early church in the first pages that we're writing in the New Testament, and yet they abandoned the Sabbath to worship on the first day of the week, as we read in those passages. And those into the 2nd century did the same thing. And so they've not abandoned, the faith is not going by the wayside. Again, things are creeping in, but we're reading that they're doing things exactly like you read in the New Testament. All right, let's think finally about where they assembled. One of the things that we find early on, of course, is outdoor meetings. They met with no building at all. They just met. And you remember in Philippi, Paul went out to the river. It says he left the city and went out to the riverside where the women that were there met. And that you had to have 10 men to form a synagogue. So we know that Philippi didn't have 10 Jewish men, or a synagogue would have been established. But there they met Lydia, and later, because he's thrown in prison there, converts the Philippian jailer. But so what was common that we see among Jews sometimes, when there wasn't enough men to form a synagogue, we know was true of Christians. More commonly, Ferguson points out in Early Christian Speak, more commonly a wealthy Christian made a room in his house available for Christian meetings. This room or complex of rooms then might be reserved for Christian use. And this was the case we find with a 4th century. Remember, 4th century is from 300 AD to 400 AD. So in that time period, a Roman villa at Lullingstone in Kent, and there's a picture of its reconstruction in the bottom right-hand corner, what it would have looked like or might have looked like from the ruins they have found. And again, remember in Romans 16, you find Paul mentioning, greet the church that is in the house of so-and-so. So churches, groups of Christians, assemblies met in homes, met in people's houses. On the bottom left, there is the reason we know it was a Christian. There was a part of this Roman villa, obviously a wealthy family, that devoted part of it to worshiping Jesus Christ. That's how we know, because of the fresco that is found painted on the wall, and it's been restored and is in the British Museum, and there it is on the left. Fresco contains the Christian symbol Chi Rho, and Chi is our letter X, and Rho is the letter R, but is made like our P with that long stem you see going down to the middle of the X. And that's the first 3 letters of the word Christos, okay? So the CH, Chi, or Ki, you may hear it pronounced sometime, and then Rho, the R. So the Chi Rho became a symbol of Christianity. You would find that many times, the letter, our letter X, and Rho, the letter R. And then notice to the left and the right of the X, Alpha and Omega, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Remember, that became a symbol of Jesus too. He said, I am the Alpha and the Omega in the book of Revelation. And so that clearly marks that somebody in that great Christian or great Roman villa in Kent, the south eastern side of southeastern side of England were Christians, and so this was one of the places we know that Christians met. The next stage, Ferguson points out, was that a house would be acquired and remodeled into a church building. So basically, buying a house and then fixing it up to be a place that Christians could meet. And this is represented by a third century. So that'd be from the 200 to 300 AD. This was discovered, Christian building at Dura Europos, early identified, this is in Syria, earliest identified Christian meeting house. And so here it is, it's ruins with the chapel that's on the far right. And the reason we know that is these paintings, these frescoes are found there. Christ and Peter walking on water. These are housed, by the way, at the Yale University Art Gallery. You can see them there if you wanted to see them someday. The healing of the paralytic and others. I just gave you a couple of samples. And so that's how we know that Christians were worshiping. Now, here's the sad thing. Thank goodness those were rescued. ISIS, modern ISIS, has taken control of that area, or did. They may have been driven out and destroyed. I know that a lot of that, I've lost sight of where all of that happened, but they were destroying all kinds of sites and sadly ruined many things that are of archaeological significance. So we don't know what's happened to that particular old church building. And then finally, the next and final stage, of course, it wasn't until Constantine, remember, that he makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, do we find specially constructed buildings that would have then been erected for that. And then they became very, very ornate. At first, they were just simple halls, but then the Constantian basilicas. And so the very first of them is called the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran. There it is, and you can see it in Rome today, and it has there's been a building built onto it, and far fancier. But this was the one that was given by Constantine to the Pope Matildes, right after the Edict of Milan, when all cessation of persecution by the Romans against Christians in AD 313. So following Diocletian's great persecution. But inside that now, the main body of the basilica, this radical transformation, and I think the 13th, 14th century by Francesco Borromini, who you can just see how just ornate and elaborate. And if you've ever toured the Vatican, this actually lies outside of Vatican City. You just know the just unbelievable wealth as time would go on, and of course the church would become less and less resembling the church of the early first century and the centuries just right there that we're studying. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the study today. Next week we're going to look at what did the early Christians in the second century believe about baptism. I think you'll find that very fascinating. We're just going to be devoting the entire study to that. And then the next week we'll be looking at how did infant baptism arise. And I think you'll find that fascinating, that there were those that fought it, that didn't believe it because it's not taught in the Bible. And I think that has very, very important practical implications for how false doctrine creeps in and things that we can learn. So thank you for listening today, and we'll look forward to you coming back next week.